Hi, YouTube. Let's get Facebook involved before we start today's Storytime Sunday. Hello, everybody on YouTube and Facebook. I am really glad you're joining me today for episode 6 of Storytime Sunday. Happy New Year for those of you who only tune in for Storytime Sunday and not my sermon. I hope you had a wonderful New Year. Today's story actually roughly comes from the Bible with some details. Well, at least the beginning of it does. First of all, let me say this story is for a mature audience. So if you have any children in the room, get them out, please. I'll give you a second to do that. A few minutes to do that. Okay. This story is taken from one of my favorite songs by Celine Dion. It's called To Love You More. Okay, it starts off with Roger Hamold. Roger is a pastor's son. He grew up going to church. He loves the Lord and will do anything to serve the Lord. And his father is a popular televangelist. And what happened? He was all slated to take over when his father died. His father had a mega church, and lives were getting saved, and people were getting healed and freed from around the world, and a television broadcast, and a podcast, and a thriving online ministry, a really vibrant, wonderful church his father pastored. He was, and he also was a good-looking guy, Roger. And all the ladies were after him. He's about 28 when the story takes place. And he had a really good life, great family, taught him about the Lord, and he got his little soul saved at the age of 7 and has been walking with the Lord ever since. And ever since Roger was a little kid, he really knew how to hear the voice of God, really could respond to the voice of God really quickly. And when he was at the age of 10, he developed a prophetic gift, which means he would dream something and it would happen. So not only was he gifted for ministry, but he was gifted prophetically as well. And when he was about 19, he had a dream that he was going up to heaven, and then all of a sudden when he got to the gate of glory, the Lord said, I'm not ready for you yet. And this woman, this shadow of a woman, came to him, and that was it. So after this shadow of a woman came to him in a dream, he just woke up, and it would be a reoccurring dream. All the time, this dream would reoccur and reoccur and reoccur. And he was like, what's going on? And one day when he was about 21, he had this dream straight for 2 years. He heard the Lord say, I have called you to be an extraordinary husband. And he said, you've called me to be an extraordinary husband. What does that mean? But Roger didn't get any information other than he's been called to be an extraordinary husband. So what happened was when he was about let's say, that was when he was 21, let's say about 25, at the age of 25, he was going to speak at a church. But what happened was he took a wrong turn to this into kind of the seedy district of the town he was preaching at, because at that time he broke away from his father's ministry, and he was really developing his own ministry. And with this amazing prophetic gift, he was called upon all the time to speak. And so he was in this seedy part of town, and he was driving, and you could tell it was seedy because of the burned out buildings and the graffiti on the buildings, and the homeless people sleeping on the street. A really seedy part of town. And you could and then he was running late for this speaking engagement, and he was lost. But he really had to use the bathroom. So what happened was he didn't really want to go into a bar to use the bathroom, but in that neighborhood, he had no choice. So what happened was he went into a bar to use the bathroom, and he got out because he really needed to pee. He really needed to go to the bathroom. So he got out and went in to use the bathroom. And then when he was coming out, this lady, about his own age, she was about 23, short skirt, tons of makeup, and all of that, stopped him and said, are you looking for a date? And he said, no, thank you. And she said, oh, come on. You know you're looking for a date. And he said, no, thank you. I'm I'm late for an engagement. I'm I'm sorry. And he kind of brushed her off. And then he got the right directions to this speaking engagement. He stopped and asked for the directions to the speaking engagement, and then he got the right directions, and then he spoke at this church, and places people got healed, and he prophetically spoke into people's lives, and it was wonderful. But for some strange reason, he could not get that um, that prostitute's face out of his mind, or that young lady's face. He didn't know that she was a prostitute at the time. So he went to ask this young lady's face kept appearing and appearing in his mind all night, not in a sexual way, but there was something about her eyes that he was totally enamored by, something about her soul that was so sad and so reaching for something that he just couldn't get out of his mind. And he had the dream again where he went up to heaven and the Lord said, "I'm not ready for you yet." And the woman and the woman came, and then he woke up, the same dream that he'd been having for about a few years. And then the next night, he decided to stay in. He decided to go back to that seedy part of town, and he's like, "What am I doing here? Really, what am I doing here? This is not a place for a person like me to be with all these drug addicts and homeless people and prostitutes around." And then at the same corner, same bar, he saw the bar, and something said to him, "Go in. She's in there." The Lord spoke to him and said, "Go in. She's in there." So he went into the same bar again, and sure enough, the same heavily made up lady, about his age, with the sad, soulish eyes that needed reaching from the night before, was sitting there. And she said the same thing. She said, "Hey, want a date?" And he said, "No, I'm actually." She said, "Are you running off to somewhere again?" And he said, "No, not tonight. I'm just here because I was speaking in town or whatever." She looked at him and said, "Are you a businessman? Um, do you work at a bank or something?" And he said, "No, I'm a preacher." And she kind of shrank back, like she was afraid that he would judge her or whatever. And he's like, "No, no." And he could sense that she was afraid when he told her that he was a preacher. And he said, "No, no, no, don't worry, I won't judge you." And so they continued talking and talking and talking. And he found out that she grew up in a very different environment than he did. Her parents were both on drugs, and at 16, her mother and her father both OD'd, and then she was left on her own, and then she met a pimp, and then the pimp got her into this business at 17, and now she's like one of the most popular prostitutes on the strip. Yeah, she's been arrested a few times, but the money is good, and she had to drop out of school when her parents died, so she doesn't have a proper education. Uh, and so he told her about his past, his father being a world-renowned minister, and all of his how he grew up, knowing about the Lord and knowing about the church and whatever. And before they knew it, they had been talking for 2 hours, and and he said, "Okay." Um, he's he said, "Okay, maybe I'll come back tomorrow." And she said, "Yeah, right. A guy like you will bother with a girl like me and come back tomorrow?" He said, "Sure, why not?" So he left the bar. Um, he left the bar, and that night, when he got home, um, he when he got back to the hotel, he had the same dream again, but this time when the Lord said, I'm not ready for you yet," and the lady came, it was um it was her, and like these two fingers came down together, and and the Lord said, "I've called you two together." And then he woke up, and he couldn't believe it, that the lady that he'd saw in his dream for about 3 years, for about 2 years, was the same lady, was the prostitute. She was not in shadow anymore. It like she was revealed, and the Lord had said, "I had called you two together." And then he went back there again for the third time, but this time she wasn't at the bar. She was, and he looked for her and looked for her and asked the bartender. The bartender said um, she didn't come in there that night, and he didn't know where she was. She usually picked up her customers there, but he didn't know where she was. So Roger looked for her and found her. No, he was about to give up and go home when he heard yelling, screaming, swearing, and he heard like a woman screaming, and men beating on a woman. So he he called the police and ran towards the sound. And when he rounded the alley, it was her, barely breathing. It was her, panting on the floor and barely breathing. And the guy was about to strike another punch. And he said, and the guy had a knife to her throat. And he said, and Roger said, "Put the knife down and leave her alone." And Roger didn't have any weapon or anything. He was a preacher. He didn't carry weapons. But for some reason, the authority in his voice commanded business, and the guys that were beating her up and had a knife to her throat dropped their weapons and ran. It was the power of God in his voice. They just dropped everything and ran, and he was able to take her. He was able to get her an ambulance and ride behind them to the hospital. And when they were in the hospital, he asked the lady her name because usually prostitutes around that area didn't give their real names. So he asked her name, and she said, and she laughed, and she said, "You're not going to believe me if I tell you my name." He said, "Try me." She said, "My name is Cindy Crawford because my mom was my mom's last name and dad's last name is Crawford, and my mom was a huge fan of the novel of the model, and that's why she named me Cindy." And he says, "Oh, your name is Cindy Crawford." It's like, "Oh yeah." And then they laughed and whatever. And he's like, "Cindy, I know we haven't known each other a long time, but I really don't feel comfortable letting you out on the street, letting you go on the streets by yourself." She's like, "Don't worry, I've been doing it since I was 16, since I was 17. Don't worry." And she wouldn't accept his help. But he said, "At least take my telephone number so that if you need help, you can call me." And okay, she took his telephone number, and about 2 weeks later, at 1 o'clock in the morning, he got a phone call from her saying that she was in trouble because she had taken some bad drugs, bad crack, and she had OD'd, and now she'd felt terrible, and now she'd ended up in the hospital again. She, oh, I'm sorry. She didn't make the call. A nurse made the call, and he ran to the hospital again and said, "Cindy, you really need to get out of this lifestyle. It's dangerous for you, but I'm here to help you." And she said, "How?" She said, "Well, I am." He said, "Well," she said, "How?" And he said, "Well, you're going to think this is a little strange, but I would be willing to marry you just to get you off of the streets." And she laughed and laughed. She's like, "You would marry a person like me just to get me off of the streets?" He's like, yeah, I would. I'm not married, and I assume you're not married. She's like, no, but isn't that strange to do in this day and age, to just get married? He's like, well, as a Christian, we don't believe in living together before we're married, and it would be strange for me to just, you know, just provide you with money and stuff. So I think that would be something for you to think about. And she said, wouldn't you want a wife more suited to your needs, like a preacher's daughter or someone more holy? He's like, there's none holy but God. We are all sinners and we're only saved by his grace. And she looks at him like, okay, buddy. And there's and he says, well, at least think about it. And she says, yeah, I will really do that. So about a month after she got out of the hospital for the second time, she was it was a routine customer. She was in this guy's apartment. She went to this guy's apartment after this guy propositioned her on the street as usual. And she was holed up in this guy's apartment. He pulled a gun on her and threatened to kill her if she didn't give him all of her money. And she gave him the money because of her life. And then he raped her. And then after he raped her, he left her there. And then all of a sudden she remembered the card in his jacket. And she called him and said, in a weak voice, she said, okay, I'll do it. Can you come and get me? So basically, about a month after that, they got the marriage license. Everybody thought he was crazy for this righteous man, Roger Hamill, marrying a prostitute. Everybody thought he was crazy for doing that. And his father was like, what are you doing? You're bringing shame onto the ministry, and you don't even love her. You don't even know her. What are you doing? And he said to his dad, remember that dream I've been having for almost 2 years now? For over 2 years now. Well, he said, well, it's her that the Lord has told me that that he was calling us together. It's her. She's the one. And the Lord said I was going to be he said I was going to be a husband. And he's like, yeah, I know, but he says, but nothing, Dad. I'm supposed to marry her. And then his dad shrugged his shoulders, said, okay, if this is what the Lord wants you to do, we'll stand by you. So after about a month, they were married. And the first little while when they got married, it was still the same thing. She would still sneak out at night, although she didn't have to at that point. But she was so used to the life that she just kind of snuck out anyway. She would get in trouble, call him, and then he would come get her out of whatever scrape she happened to be in. And there was a point though where, because during this time, she wouldn't come to church with him. He would ask her, she would say no every Sunday, and he just got tired of asking until one day she just thought she would go to get him off her back. And then and then that Sunday that she decided to go, she was, the preacher was preaching on the story of Gomer. Her father-in-law was preaching on the story of Gomer and how Hosea was told to marry a prostitute like her. Not like her, but like her. She assumed it was her. And something about Hosea and Gomer's story really touched her heart. So she went home and she couldn't stop crying. All the way home, she couldn't stop crying. So she accepted Jesus that night by her bedside with her husband by her side, because her husband asked her in the car why was she crying, and then she couldn't answer. And then again in bed, her husband asked her, because she was still crying, why was she crying? And she's like, I don't know, but I think something really got to me about that story. And her husband really ministered to her about the love of God and whatever. Not whatever, really ministered to her about salvation and how the love of God is just no respecter of persons. He doesn't care who you are. He takes you as you are and makes you who he wants you to be. So at that point, she by her husband's side accepted the Lord Jesus Christ into her life. But that's not the end of the story, because after she accepted the Lord into her life, it was a complete turnaround. Her life started to change. Her dealings with the drug dealer stopped. Her actions became for the Lord. She became on fire for his word. And she developed a call. She felt a few months after her dramatic conversion that she had to tell her story to everyone she knew. So she would stop people on the street, tell them her story. She would go to different churches and tell her story. She would be telling her story everywhere and saving lives like crazy. And then as her popularity built, as her story and her preaching gift developed, or she became aware of her calling to preach, her husband loved her still, but his popularity began to dim, because people would ask about his wife and her amazing story. And what happened was people started wanting to call her instead of her husband. So she developed a busy itinerary because of her unique way of sharing the word of God and powerful way to bring people to Christ with her story of being a prostitute and being on the street and having her husband see something in her that needed the Lord. So she was going all around the country, being sought after by every church, every prophet, everybody wanted to hear this woman's story and wanted to see this woman preach. But all of that was actually taking a toll on her marriage. And there was a time that she was scheduled to go for a speaking engagement, and she was going to leave her husband to go for the speaking engagement. But when she left, her husband followed her, and her husband said, "Why don't you love me?" She's like, "What are you talking about? Of course I love you. You saved me from the streets. You gave me this life. You introduced me to Christ. You supported my ministry. Of course I love you." She's like, No. He's like, "No, you love what I did for you, but you don't love me." He's like, She's like, "What do you mean I don't love you?" He's like, "You never hold me, you never hug me, you never tell me how much you care, and you're never affectionate towards me. You like what I did for you and what I can do for you and what my connections do for you, but you don't love me." She's like, he's like, "You're so open with everyone about your story. You're so open with everyone about what God has done in your life, but you're so closed off with me." Like, he's like, "We make love, but you're still kind of closed off for me." And he's like, "Why?" And she's like, "I don't know what you're talking about." And then she runs off and does her speaking engagement. But all the way through her speaking engagement, the Lord is working on her heart, and she goes back to the moment in which she was saved by her bedside, and she realized that although she gave her heart to the Lord, she didn't give herself physically. Although she said the words in a prayer, and although she made vows to her husband, she didn't give herself physically, or she didn't give herself emotionally to her husband or to God. So she repented of that, and she says, "I've got to talk to my husband." So she went home and she really talked to him about how she was feeling, about how, although she was saved, all her energy was taken up with this ministry, and she forgot about what was important, which means a real relationship with God and her family. And she vowed never to let that happen again. And she vowed to even go to counseling to understand how to really communicate and to be a wife, not just a preacher. And she thanked him for loving her through it, although even when she was unlovable. And that's the end of the story. And they had to work on their marriage to be to be intimate with each other, not sexually, but otherwise too. I hope you enjoyed this story. Thanks. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys later. Bye. It's funny that this story came to me by listening to a song by Celine Dion about how we often give ourselves to God. We say the words, but we hold back in so many ways, in so many parts of our lives, like Cindy did to her husband. And the Lord is saying today, go back to your first love. He's like, I want your life. He's like, I just don't want words that you say on Sunday. He's like, I want your life. I want every aspect of you. I want your finances. I want your family relationships. I want your romantic relationships. I want to know you. And he's dying to get to know you today. And it's so easy to get to know the Lord. All you need to do is ask him to come in your own little way, wherever you are today. I hope you enjoyed my story. Sorry if it was a little rambling. Usually I have an idea of these things, but I don't write them out or anything. So sorry if it was a little rambling. I'll see you next week for Storytime Sunday. Bye. I'll be waiting for you here inside my heart. I'm the one who wants to love you more. Oh, can't you see I can give you everything you need? Let me be the one to love you more. Oh, 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 oh. See you next week. Bye. Take care. Hi, YouTube. See you next week, YouTube. Bye.